So I want to talk about one thing that I hear a lot of people saying. Like, it's kind of like the conflation of the term hipster and bugman, because I see a lot of people using the terms interchangeably, like, oh, these urbanite bugmen hipsters, and I just want to correct this right now. Hipsters and bugmen are two very different things, and I'm going to explain why. Whether you like them or not, hipsters are very different from bugmen. The thing about hipsters is hipsters are basically a subculture that began at some point in the 2000s that revolves around essentially listening to indie music, frequenting local businesses like local restaurants and bars, and a kind of urbanite lifestyle that is largely based around local music, local food, etc., and things like that. Now, love it or hate it, the fact is hipsterism kind of unironically is the last stand of implicit white identity. Like, hipsterism, say what you will about it, but it was a genuine movement to try and essentially get some form of organic, predominantly white culture back into the cities, and especially in some of the most historic neighborhoods in the cities, because a lot of hipsters tended to gravitate specifically toward neighborhoods that have a lot of historic architecture in these cities. So, and also it was a movement to reject a lot of the really like mainstream commodified music and embrace indie music instead. Now, again, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of bands in that genre. Like, there's a few that I'm kind of into. Like, you know, I like a few songs by, like, you know, The Killers or Broken Social Scene or Arcade Fire, but I'm not hugely into any of these bands or into the genre as a whole. That being said, I respect the fact that at least it's not Taylor Swift. At least it's not, you know, Jay-Z, Kanye West, whoever's the big rapper of the day. I respect the fact that at least it's something that's not the most commercialized, mass-marketed, pushed in your face, mainstream generic drivel possible. Even though it may not be my cup of tea per se, the music, I respect it insofar as it's not the most basic shit possible. So hipsterism, if it has one core value, I think that value is authenticity. And I would call that one of my core values also. Because I do think the local is more authentic than the global. The things that are unique and handcrafted are better than things that are mass marketed, like literally or figuratively. And I respect hipsterism for trying to hold on to that. And people argue like, well, hipsters are privileged. They have enough money for this shit. It's like, yes, absolutely. You do need to have money to afford these kinds of things. But for those who do have money, why not go for it? That's my question. Like, if they could be rich and pursue authentic things, or rich and pursue really tacky fake shit, why not pursue authentic shit if you have the money for it? So that's how I feel about hipsterdom. Now, hipsters kind of do still exist, but like, you know, to paraphrase Tony Soprano, I kind of feel like the best days of this thing are behind us. That's kind of how I feel about hipsterism. Like, it still sort of exists, but it's way past its prime as a subculture, as a movement. It's just, you know, it's kind of more of, I would say, a 2000s and 2010s thing. Even in the 2010s, I feel like it was dying in like the latter half of the 2010s. Like, I would say there was still definitely a strong hipster culture. Like, even when I was living in Toronto in the 2010s, like I felt there was still a strong sense of that culture there. But it was on its way out a little bit even then. And I do feel like it's a bit more of a millennial thing. Like, it's a thing specifically associated with millennials who are, you know, in their 20s, maybe teens, perhaps early 30s, but I get the vibe that it's something like a lot of people, when they get into their 30s, they just want to become suburbanites. And I feel like the events of the last few years, you know, the big event in 2020 kind of accelerated that for a lot of people around that age, around my age, people who were entering into their 30s at the time. So yeah, all things considered, I feel like hipsterism is dying out. it's definitely past its heyday. Now, there might be people who live a similar lifestyle these days, like young urban people who like kind of niche stuff. But I just feel like that entire scene, insofar as it still exists, insofar as Gen Z has adopted it, it's kind of a shadow of its former self. It's a very pale shadow of its former self. Bugmanism, on the other hand, it's not so much a subculture or a movement as it is just embodying the mainstream culture. What Bugmanism is about is essentially hipsters crave authenticity, but Bugmen are the opposite, and Bugman is really a gender neutral term. You can be Bugman, Bugwoman, Bug, they, them, whatever. Bug non-binary. Like, for a Bugman, okay, hipsters crave the authentic, but for Bugmen, the more fake, the better. They like things that are mass-produced. They like things that are fake, that are tacky, that are mass-marketed, mass-produced, mainstream, basic. The more mass-produced, the better. So, like, where hipsters like independent restaurants, Bugmen like chains. Where hipsters like indie movies, Bugmen like Marvel and DC and Star Wars and stuff like that. Where hipsters like traditional architecture, Bugmen, they either tend to like either modernist high-rises like glass condominiums, or your typical cookie-cutter suburban sprawl, or anything kind of in between. They might like certain types of townhouse complexes also maybe, but nothing too authentic though. It's got to be one of those like self-contained, more recent townhouse complexes, because God forbid it starts feeling like an actual living, breathing neighborhood. We can't have that. So yeah, for Bugmen, it's like the more fake, the better. The more mainstream, the better. And that's really the difference between the two. And it's like, say what you will about hipsters, at least they're not fucking Bugmen. At least hipsters were grasping for something real, something authentic, and they may honestly be the last major subculture to do it. So, I mean, we ragged on hipsters at the time, we shit on them, but the truth is they were the one thing holding back the flow of the nothingness, like kind of like in the Never-Ending Story, literally the nothing, like the cultural nothingness. They were the ones holding that dam from breaking. They were pretty much the only ones. And you know, again, like their music may not be my cup of tea, although I guess there's some overlap because Radiohead is a band I really like, and it's not considered indie per se, but I think it has some of the same sound as indie. Like it's sort of like in a bit of a Venn diagram gray area, but the overlap between the kind of music they like and the kind of music I like, because I like more like, let's say, like prog metal, prog rock, stuff of that nature. Whereas, yeah, hipsters are more like indie music. So I think like Radiohead is a good example of something that bridges that gap. So yeah, I mean, there's some overlap. But regardless, even if their tastes as a whole are not my cup of tea, I at least respect them for that, because the kind of stuff I'm into, it never managed to really be its own subculture in the way that hipsterism was, or to a lesser extent still is. So I respect them for that. And you know what? My fedora is off to hipsters. I tip my fedora to them. I respect them because they were the last stand of implicit white identity, the last stand of implicit authenticity in any shape or form. And Bugmanism is what's kind of replacing them, and it's much, much worse. It is much, much worse. So, yeah. God bless hipsters.